Thus far, on day 3 of the Genesis creation story, we have examined the error the biblical author made in asserting that the seas came first on planet Earth, out of which rose the dry land. In fact, the Earth started as a ball of molten rock, which over millions of years cooled into a thin crust. Millions upon millions of years later, rain condensed in the early atmosphere, raining down in a deluge the like of which had never been seen before or since, turning the Earth into a water world. The early crust then thrust up volcanic islands in this green, iron-rich world sea, which, over time, were worn down and disappeared beneath the punishing waves. Much later in Earth's history, titanic forces again thrust up new land, but these were islands of granite, the cores of which would become today's continents. Clearly, Genesis erred in its assertion that, strictly speaking, the seas came first, and then the land. It would have been more accurate to record that the land came first, then the seas, then the land again. More troublesome, however, is the biblical account of what came next on that same day of creation, the instant formation of plants.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day.
The early continents for millennia were barren wastelands, devoid of any life. And as already noted, these early continents saw an Earth very different than the oases of life to come. The Earth was hellishly hot, the atmosphere filled with poisonous gases, pressures enough to crush a human being. Life as we know it could not survive in such conditions. Life did not burst upon the land the same day as these early continents were forming. It would have been snuffed out in an instant. Indeed, life came slowly, gradually creeping across the land. Evidence suggests that an algal scum formed on the land 1.2 billion years ago, but it was not until around 425 million years ago that the first true land plants appeared. However, these first land plants could hardly be confused with grass, herbs, or fruit trees. These early plants were basically small stems, no more than a few centimeters high, with no leaves, no seeds, and no flowers. Grass would not evolve until some 67 million years ago, during the latter part of the age of the dinosaurs. Features important to herbs and fruit trees like seeds and flowers did not evolve until around 360 million years ago and 130 million years ago, respectively. The actual herbs and fruit trees humans enjoy today came much, much, much later. And by the time grass, herbs, and fruit trees populated the earth, so did the land animals who exploited them for food. Indeed, by the time grass, herbs, and fruit trees were on the earth, land animals had colonized nearly every corner of the globe for hundreds of millions of years. However, if we are to believe Genesis, land animals were still another 72 hours away. And don't plants need the sun? Not only for photosynthesis, to create food, but for warmth? An Earth without a sun has numerous problems, not the least of which are no atmosphere and no warmth. And yet, according to the Genesis creation story, the sun was not to arrive for another 24 hours. In that time, the Earth and her newly formed plants would have been plunged into an inky darkness and temperatures at absolute zero. But not everyone believes Genesis the way it was written. Some, as we've come to learn, feel the need to reinterpret and virtually rewrite it. Gerald Schroeder, for example, apparently feels that Genesis is a bit too specific, naming grass, herbs, and fruit trees as part of the first vegetation to appear on the land, and neglects to include these in his summation of Genesis 1, 9 through 13. Merely writing that the Bible describes the first plants appearing and equating this with bacteria and photosynthetic algae. Andrew Parker, in his The Genesis Enigma, follows suit. He writes, The ancient Israelites would have been oblivious to any single-celled life forms, let alone cyanobacteria specifically. The writer of Genesis could not have had a word for cyanobacteria, or anything remotely similar in his vocabulary. Single-celled photosynthetic forms, some of the earliest life forms on Earth, would have lain well beyond his grasp. But the plants mentioned in the third stage of the Genesis creation account actually contain modified cyanobacteria. Not only must Parker twist and turn Genesis to fit modern science, he must twist and turn modern science to fit Genesis. What he means by the grass, herbs, and fruit trees of Genesis containing modified cyanobacteria, which is what he is asserting the writer of Genesis is implying, actually trying under the constraints of his divinely inspired but scientifically ignorant and limited mind to say, is that these plants contain chloroplasts, the factories which photosynthesize sunlight and give nourishment to the plant, which are organelles formed from eukaryote cells, which are themselves evolved cyanobacteria. See how easy it is, once you know the secret code, to understand that grass, herbs, and fruit trees really mean early cyanobacteria, which, however, evolved in the seas, not on land. Hardly any time needs to be spent on these rationalizations, as they simply do not accurately reflect the text or context of Genesis 1. The painful contortions to rescue Genesis alone are enough to grant them dismissal. Like others, ignoring a plain reading of the biblical text, yet straining to force Genesis to fit with the findings of modern science, Andrew Parker concludes that Genesis is nonetheless the work of a divine hand. He states that the first chapter of Genesis could, perhaps more than any other, represent God's hand in the Bible due to what he thinks is its amazing pre-scientific accuracy. And yet this same divine inspiration could not have the writer of Genesis 1 simply write first plants, but instead inspired three of the most evolutionarily complex, sophisticated, and late-arriving plant life as stand-ins for the relatively simple bacteria. This becomes Parker's conclusion that the Bible was divinely inspired by a supernatural intelligence.